Thank you, Stan, for the weather. And now time for the Tar Heel Time Traveler. Good morning and welcome to this episode of the Tar Heel Time Traveler with me, your host, Gracie Jackson, on Laurinburg News. Today we're taking a look back 100 years in the past to the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, and the era of Prohibition. So, we're going to be looking at what aspects of the U.S. most led to an increase in drinking, which led to Prohibition during this time. Why was it specifically in the 1920s? Well, maybe I can give you some information to help us navigate through this question. So, the Prohibition took place from 1920 to 1933, and the 18th Amendment enacted this, and it was also backed by the Volstead Act. And this led to black markets for alcohol, with organized crime, the mob being like the main producer of the alcohol. And so causes of Prohibition were, you had the dries, which were the prohibitionists, and a lot of these prohibitionists were women, or they started out with women, because husbands were coming home, spending their money, getting drunk, and then abusing. It caused abuse in the home. And so there was a big fear of what alcohol would do to families. There was a concern there. And because the wives were so concerned because they were at home doing everything for their family and the husbands were out all night, they were some of the main propulsionists for the Prohibition. And so 100 years before that, though, so take it back to the 1820s, there was a revival led by Lyman Beecher, and he preached, the evil of alcohol. So this was a long time coming. The Prohibition was just kind of a series of events that led up to the big prohibition of alcohol. And so they believed that alcohol would also decrease church activity because, religion, a lot of people were still concerned with religion these days. And so a lot of people in America, obviously all the white people really were from Anglo-Saxon roots. That's how America was formed. And Anglo-Saxons, are anyone who descends from whites who lived in English-speaking countries. And they believed that by removing alcohol, it would solve all the problems in the U.S. Also, real quick, just to give you a definition of Prohibition, or a thought about Prohibition, is to protect individuals and families from scourge and drunkenness. And so now let's move on to the impact. So first off, you had your bootleggers, which were people who supplied alcohol illegally in the U.S. or brought it into the U.S. illegally. And then you had your speakeasies, which were your private bars. They were literally just doors, and people would walk up to them, get in, say the password maybe, like you see in the movies, and those were your speakeasies. People would go in there and dance and drink. And then also, another impact of the Prohibition was that you had a lot of people getting paid off. And what I mean by that is when the people who were supposed to enforce the Prohibition Act, the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, whatever, they were your Justice Department and IRS. So this was like the actual government who was supposed to enforce this. The mobsters and people who had enough money, if they would get caught, they would pay them off. And so people who were enforcing this law were getting hundreds of thousands of dollars to not report them to a higher level of authority. And also, another impact of Prohibition is that it led to organized crime because, like I said earlier, you had a black market for alcohol, and that was all the mob and all this organized crime stuff. So you had Al Capone or Scarface. He was supplying so much liquor. He was in Chicago, and Chicago was actually, its leading sale was liquor. And there were 1,000 unlicensed bars in that area at that time. And then you had moonshine, and that was still illegal to this. That's still illegal to this day. That was developed during this time of Prohibition, and so you had a lot of organized crime come out of this, gang violence, like your St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That was by Al Capone and the mob. And so you can see that while people wanted or hoped that this would have a good outcome in the U.S., that this would stop drinking, it actually increased. And it increased violence and the mob and all sorts of things like that. So just remember, many things impacted and came out of Prohibition as a result of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, although it did not stick, and after 1933, Prohibition was over.